From WNPR, I'm John Dankosky, and this is The Wheelhouse.
North Korea told the U.S. that a year ago, while in North Korean custody, Warmbier contracted botulism.
The suggestion that I participated in any collusion, that I was aware of any collusion with the Russian government to hurt this country is an appalling and detestable lie.
Do you believe that the president is seriously considering getting rid of Bob Mueller, and why do you think that?
I think it's a consideration the president has had because Mueller is illegitimate as special counsel.
Mr. President, we thank you for the opportunity and the blessing that you've given us to serve your agenda and the American people, and we're continuing to work very hard every day to accomplish those goals.
I don't think it's for me to say whether the conversation I had with the president was an effort to obstruct. I took it as a very disturbing thing, very concerning.
So I need to be correct as best I can.
I do want you to be honest.
And I'm not able to be rushed this fast. It makes me nervous.
If you want to join our conversation, 860-275-7266. Comment on our website, wnpr.org/The Wheelhouse. You can find us on Facebook and Twitter at WNPR Wheelhouse. We will take our time going through the news today with Colin McEnroe, host of The Colin McEnroe Show on WNPR. Hello there, Colin.
Good morning, Mr. Dankosky.
Also with us is Leah Wright-Rigueur. She's Assistant Professor of Public Policy at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government, and she's author of The Loneliness of the Black Republican, Pragmatic Politics in the Pursuit of Power. Hi there, Leah.
Hi, always good to be here.
And Chris Powell is here. He's managing editor of the Journal-Inquirer. Hello once again, Chris.
Hi, John.
Well, we've got a lot to talk about, and we're going to start in Washington. But first, a breaking news story that we're going to be updating throughout the day on NPR. A gunman opened fire on congressmen who were getting ready for a congressional baseball game in Virginia. Steve Scalise, Majority Whip of the House of Representatives, was shot at this baseball field in Alexandria, Virginia. Opened fire near a YMCA, the gunman did. The suspect, they say, is in custody. Scalise has a hip wound. We don't know much more about others wounded in that shooting. It's of all the shootings that we see and hear and talk about across America, Colin, this is always something that's a little bit bracing and shocking whenever you see an attack on a congressperson.
Right. And this obviously is not the first time that has happened. You know, just to contextualize it, though, if this is an average day in America, 93 people will die from gun homicides, and twice that many will be injured. It looks like Congressman Scalise will be, fortunately, if that's the right word, in that second category. I mean, what's remarkable about this, I mean, probably the reason that we still have a fog of war thing, so I don't want to really say, exactly how this is going to play out. We don't really know. We don't have the complete information. But if, in fact, as we all hope, nobody dies in this, it'll probably be because they had Capitol security around them. I mean, it seems to me unlikely that a bunch of congressmen are going to be anywhere without some kind of security detail nearby. It does appear that at least one of the people who got shot, according to one eyewitness testimony, was some kind of security person who stepped out of a car and told the assailant to drop his weapon. So these are people who probably are, by and large, safer than most Americans. I mean, they enjoy a higher level of security where they work. They enjoy a higher level of security probably in general. But it's sort of nobody's safe.
And it's a very scary and sad story. We will continue to update it on NPR throughout the day. It only happened within the last hour, and so we don't know too much more. We will pass along any information as it becomes available. Of course, throughout the course of the last week, a lot of the news that's been coming out of the Washington, D.C. area has been happening in front of the Senate Intelligence Committee. A lot of questions for Jim Comey, first of all, last week, and then questions yesterday for a few hours of Attorney General Jeff Sessions. Of course, Sessions had recused himself from any Russia investigation, but seemed to be pretty involved in some way, at least, in the firing of Jim Comey. He goes up to Capitol Hill. Colin, I'll get your take first on some of the highlights that you heard from yesterday. And when asked a lot of questions by a lot of senators, didn't have a whole lot to say.
Right. So this hearing, I think you could argue it had two main purposes. This inquiry had two main purposes. One of them was to flesh out any more knowledge that might be available about what kind of contact Jeff Sessions had with Russian representatives, particularly either in his capacity as a member of the campaign or in his capacity as a newly appointed attorney general, whatever. And then the other one was to figure out what his role was in the Comey firing. And I think probably a little bit more progress, sort of, or he was more responsive on the first question than he was on the second question. And in the second, and those two questions are yoked together by the fact that he has recused himself from anything having to do with the Russia investigation. Nominally, I mean, the official administration version, minus things the president has actually said about it, is that he could still participate in the firing of James Comey because that had nothing to do with the Russia investigation, except that the president then went and told Lester Holt that it did. So you have this enormously kind of confusing picture, made more confusing by the fact that I think the thing that supplanted both of those questions yesterday was the question of how much information is Jeff Sessions obligated to give, and how much can he legitimately withhold? He invoked this kind of gray area policy that you don't talk about things that you talked about the president with, if you think the president might exercise his executive privilege somewhere down the line. But that's so gray as to stretch out over the entire landscape. In other words, I was saying before the show, it just this has come up now twice, really. This notion that if you talk to the president, then you can't tell anybody what got said, which is insane. I mean, it's kind of the opposite of the way our system is supposed to work. If the Postmaster General goes in there and talks to the president about stamps, he's not forbidden to tell people what the president said about stamps, and so, I mean, you really do have to. I'm babbling here. The last thing I'll say is, I think one of the things they probably have to do, really have to do, is get Sessions back in front of some kind of congressional committee with a plan for picking apart this argument, a better plan than they had yesterday for picking apart this question of what is confidential and what isn't. And the Democrats probably have to be at least prepared to threaten contempt of Congress if, in fact, he won't talk about things that seem like legitimate realms of discourse.
Leah?
So it felt a little. The whole thing feels bizarre, right? Not just Sessions, but I think also the Comey testimony and kind of the circus surrounding that. But I think you were right when you said that they didn't get very far. They didn't get very much information. I mean, the for anyone watching, I think the hearings, one of the frustrating points was how long and drawn out and kind of how kind of stretching these moments. The one thing that I'll say is that Kamala Harris was the breakout star, right? She's been the breakout star of many of these hearings, but yesterday I think put her in a different category.
Should all the white guys interrupt you right now?
I know you should, right? Everyone should stop. And I think there was this really big reaction, particularly from women and from women of color. And Tanzina Vega, who is a reporter from CNN, tweeted out and said, how many women can recount being shushed, being silenced, being told to, be quiet? And it was retweeted thousands of times and shared thousands of times, even off of social media, I think, in part because there was a moment where everybody was like, okay, here we go again, right? And so she was joined in this kind of, she's in this company with now, say, Elizabeth Warren and several of the other women in Congress who have been told, or censured and said, be quiet.
This, not to interrupt you, but this happened twice because
Right.
she had, in the Rod Rosenstein questioning, exactly the same thing happened, exactly the same two people. Senators McCain and Burr interrupted her.
Let's just actually listen to a little bit from yesterday.
Sir, I'm not asking about the principle. I'm asking when you
Well, I'm
knew that you
unable
would be
to
asked
answer the
these
question.
questions and you would rely on that policy. Did you not ask your staff to show you the policy that would be the basis for you refusing to answer the majority of questions that have been asked
should be allowed
of you?
to answer the question.
Senators will allow the chair to control the hearing. Senator Harris, let him answer.
So there, a little bit of the crosstalk is John McCain actually jumping in and deciding that he's going to control the hearing.
Right, and so this is also bizarre considering the up in the air testimony that or questioning that John McCain later embarked on with the Comey hearing earlier. Right, he's all over the place, and here you have a woman who has really made her bread and butter as prosecutor in California, asking hard hitting questions. Now, I think it does two things, right? Especially if we think of these testimonies not just about pursuit of information, but also about performance. It sets up, right, this dynamic between all of these essentially white men and women on Congress in this kind of, combative relationship. But it also is a performance for, I think, Jeff Sessions and his supporters and Donald Trump supporters, which we later saw play out on cable news. But then also, too, it sets up somebody like Kamala Harris as a figure to watch within the Democratic Party. And it makes her much wider than the circle that she has, right, just in engaging in testimony. She is now, everyone is talking about her right now.
Chris Powell, what did you see from yesterday?
Well, John, I'm delighted that this matter is incapacitating the federal government, but I'm not sure why I should care. I'm inclined to agree with Alan Dershowitz from Harvard, who keeps asking what exactly is the crime being investigated here. Talking with a Russian. A few years ago, I talked with a Russian who's supposedly close to President Putin. I had hopes of getting something out of him. All I got out of him was lunch, and I hope it wasn't a felony.
Okay, but I mean, perhaps what they're trying to investigate is obstruction of justice. Donald Trump saying, "Let's stop this investigation into Flynn. Let's go off to the side, Jim Comey. We're going to fire you if you get a little too close to Russia." Jim Comey and others saying this is not just a small deal. This is Russians getting involved in the 2016 election and maybe future elections as well.
Well, now it's obstruction of justice supposedly, though I guess. Whether Trump gave him an order or just expressed a hope is another thing. But I lived through the Nixon years, John, and as obstruction of justice goes, I'm not terribly impressed.
Colin, I mean, what do you say to that? The idea of this obstruction of justice potentially being different somehow than the obstruction of justice that happened during Watergate. We've brought this up certainly in the past before in the historical context.
Well, I mean, first of all, we don't know what this obstruction of justice is or is going to be. And certainly in terms of the ages of these respective presidencies, Watergate came when the Nixon presidency was further along. The Trump presidency has sat in this thing, this bathtub full of mildly dirty water since day one. And it does seem as though we're headed for more of this kind of thing. I mean, over the last 48 hours, first the Washington Post and then the New York Times, apparently using different sets of sources, have reported that within the White House, they are having to talk Trump out of firing Robert Mueller, and Robert Mueller hasn't done anything yet. So,
he's the special counsel who has now been appointed to investigate.
Right. So I don't think this is over, and I don't think we know what we're talking about when we say obstruction of justice. That's why you have hearings. And I think to sort of say, well, why are we having these hearings? There's nothing going on here. Well, it's why you have hearings, to see if you can figure out what actually did happen. I do want to say, apropos of Kamala Harris, her questioning of Sessions elicited, to my mind, one of the most interesting and least remarked upon moments of yesterday, which is after all that foofara of people interrupting her and stuff, she got Sessions to say that, he's always kind of wondered why things can't be more harmonious with Russia and Putin. The Soviet Union is long gone. He thinks it's tragic that things aren't on a happier footing, which can be interpreted a number of different ways. But then if you look towards the end of the hearing, and it was in particular Senator McCain who went chapter and verse over incredibly aggressive and toxic Russian intelligence incursions into the U.S., stepping far beyond electoral meddling and into more sort of conventional Cold War type espionage that they appear to be doing. And I mean, McCain seems to be trying to lay a record right there saying these are bad guys and they do not have our best interests at heart and they are after us in a very sort of old school, recognizable from the Cold War way. And I just wonder what to make of that incredible divergence between, and Sessions was kind of nodding to that and going, oh yeah, we're going to take that really seriously. But his earlier comment to Harris was very revealing and a little bit more typical of the Trump administration position towards Putin and Russia, which is, boy, we ought to find a way to make common cause with these people.
Well, let's actually hear a little bit of that comment.
I may have had some conversations, and I think I did, with the general strategic concept of the possibility of whether or not Russia and the United States could get on a more harmonious relationship and move off the hostility. The Soviet Union did, in fact, collapse. It's really a tragic strategic event that we're not able to get along better than we are today.
So a quick comment on that point, Leah, because this really is the key, and I think maybe going to something Chris said earlier, why do we care about this right now? Why are we holding these hearings? If the hearings are about finding out what Donald Trump said to Jim Comey or what Jeff Sessions said or who Jeff Sessions met with, that's one thing. If indeed the Intelligence Committee is looking deeply into the question writ large about whether or not Russia got involved in hacking into our election and what we should do about it, well, that is probably something that the Senate should take a pretty close look at.
Right. And so we've seen people from, I think, the Senate Intelligence Committee. We've seen Republican congressmen, Democratic congressmen, and the Democratic side is more of a surprise, but maybe not so much of a surprise given where we are right now, comment on their deep kind of concern about Russian interference in the election. I think one of the things that I've seen crop up over and over again has been Republicans who have been saying, we told you so, right? 4 years ago or 5 years ago, when we said Russia was a concern, when Mitt Romney said we need to take Russia seriously, everyone laughed at us, and here we are right now. So I think one of the things that we can absolutely talk about, or what people should be paying attention to, is the various wings within the Republican Party and the various divisions and splits within the Republican Party, particularly over issues of Russia and how to handle Russia and Russian aggression. This is a novel, I think, thing that we're seeing right here, which is this kind of, you have these cold warriors, John McCain and company, who are like, this is a very, very serious problem. And then kind of another wing that is emerging that's saying, hey, why can't we have an alliance with Russia like, pre-Cold War days or something like that? And it is something to watch.
Chris, what are your thoughts on this? About the seriousness with which we should be taking the threat of Russia interference in our elections?
Oh, I don't doubt that Russia does things that are hostile to the United States, just as I don't doubt that the United States does things that are hostile to Russia. I do have to laugh at the complaint of election meddling. I mean, my God, the United States has meddled in every foreign election for the last 50 years. I don't think we can be, terribly indignant about this. Again, it doesn't bother me too much because I just don't see how it really had any impact. Hillary Clinton lost the election because she couldn't carry certain Democratic districts in Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin. I don't think Russia had anything to do with that.
But if Russia moving forward, which we've already heard from the former FBI director, if Russia has the type of ability that they showed in 2016 to alter news coverage, to alter what's going into people's feeds, to alter emails, to get information changed at the last possible second, that's not a concern to you, especially as someone in the news media? I mean, the control of information that might be coming from Russia is very important. Let's say they drop stories at the 11th hour, all of a sudden that's going to change an election pretty quickly.
Everybody is propagandizing, John. We have to be on the alert for it. Those of us who are in the news business, we have to be jealous of our prerogatives. But this is just part of the world. The United States does it too. To a great extent, I think we provoke responses from other countries. I'm not making any defense of the Russian government. I'm just saying that I just don't think that the intervention that has been alleged against Russia had any impact.
A quick thought, Colin?
Well, yeah, I mean, first of all, I don't think there's any way to know whether it had an impact. This was an incredibly close election decided by the Electoral College. Famously, there's about 70,000 votes in three key swing states that amounted to the difference. I don't know. I don't think anybody can sit here with confidence and say, oh, absolutely, the Russian hack had nothing to do with this. And as journalists, we had to struggle with a question. All of us did. I did, which is, to what degree do you report on the material obtained through the DNC Podesta hack? That is significant political information that would be part of political campaign coverage, given the fact that that a cybercrime is the way that this came into existence. I just went ahead and reported on it anyway. It was fruit from a poisoned or tainted tree, but I don't see how you don't report on it. But the larger question to me is, besides altering our election, what's Putin's master game? What's the big question? You know, in the Politico piece that McCain cited yesterday, where these intelligence operatives are saying, we're finding Russian people that we think are agents in really weird places, in deserts and on beaches and all kinds of places where, like, maybe one of the common denominators is fiber optic cable. We think they're looking at our infrastructure right now, our information infrastructure. So, yeah, Chris, you might not care that they meddled with this election. You might not think it made a difference. But that's not the only thing they're trying to do. And one of the things they may be trying to do is take down our information infrastructure in a much larger way, something that maybe the United States can't be accused of having done in other countries.
Well, possibly. But I don't think that they're doing anything that we're not doing back to them in spades. And not just to them, to the whole rest of the world. Weren't we, tapping Angela Merkel's phones a few years ago?
A quick thought, Leah?
Yeah, so I just want to say I think there's a way to do both. To say that, and maybe we can talk about this later on, but that what's happening with Russia is incredibly important, but also you can't use it as a distraction from the very real problems that also led up to the election, right? So even if we had, this moment where Hillary Clinton had won, let's say she had won, and but it still would have been close, right? Nate Silver talks about that all the time, that the election, if Hillary Clinton had, been the victor, still would have been decided by a very small number, which goes back to these other kind of issues that are much deeper and much more longstanding. And yet we can still be concerned about the fact that, Russia's fingerprints are all over the place. We can walk and chew gum at the same time. And I think maybe part of what I would hope what the part of the Senate hearings are about is trying to get to, half of that chewing gum part of the equation.
I want to quickly get to Brett in New Haven. Hi, Brett.
Yes, hi.
What's up?
My question is, and it's more of a comment, and that is that the person who is defending Sessions is dismissing the concept that Russia may have meddled in our elections, saying, well, we do this too. Well, this is my country too, and I'm concerned, as are a vast majority of Americans. We want an investigation, and this administration has done nothing but try to shut it down. They're not acting as though they're innocent. They're acting as though they're guilty of high crimes.
Thank you very much, Brett, for the phone call. Quickly, Dylene, who's calling from Hartford. Dylene, go ahead.
Oh, hey, I just want to piggyback on the previous caller. This administration, including Jeff Sessions, has a pattern of obfuscation and avoidance. And my concern about Jeff Sessions is he hardly seems like a competent attorney general. His inability to respond appropriately to questions being presented to him, like with Ms. Harris, and his general forgetfulness. I question his competence to be in this position at all.
Dylene, thank you very much for the phone call. We'll go to break and with this thought from Mike, who tweeted at us, if there was a drinking game for every time you said something nice about the Trump administration, we'd all die of thirst. Thank you, Mike. I'll tell you what, I'll end with this for this section. President Donald Trump turned 71 today. Happy birthday, President. That's something nice. We're joined in the wheelhouse today by Colin McEnroe, host of the Colin McEnroe Show on WNPR, Leah Wright Rigueur from Harvard, and Chris Powell from the Journal-Inquirer. When we come back, we'll talk a little bit more about things going on in Washington, including a lawsuit Richard Blumenthal's included in, and whether or not Chris Murphy is going to be able to take on Betsy DeVos on an almost daily basis here. That's coming up in the wheelhouse. This is The Wheelhouse. I'm John Dankosky. We're talking about the week's news with Chris Powell, the managing editor of the Journal-Inquirer, Leah Wright Rigueur, who's an assistant professor of public policy at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government, and also our own Colin McEnroe. Hey, Colin, what's on your show today?
Something very different from the conversation we're having now. Every year, arguably, there is a song of the summer. Just one song to rule them all, one song to bind them. So it might be Call Me Maybe, it might be Party Rock Anthem, it might be Blurred Lines, it might be Fancy, and it's going to be something this year. Every year we get together a panel, including some people who actually make their living as DJs in the clubs, finding out what people really do like. and we try to guess what the song of the summer is, and everybody gets, for a whole bunch of different reasons, really mad at us.
Well, it's because you're not asking for their favorite song of the summer. You're talking about what is the song of the summer.
That's a big part of it.
Which is a big part of it. So that's coming up today on the Colin McEnroe Show. I'll let you know if you're interested in something very different than the song of the summer. You can join me and Dan Haar from the Hartford Courant at 5:30 as we sit down with Robert Shiller, the Nobel Prize economist at the Festival of Arts and Ideas in New Haven. We're going to be at the Yale Center for British Art, and we're going to be talking about the stories we tell ourselves about the modern economy. Schiller's been writing quite a bit about narrative economics and whether or not the economy is just really a series of stories that we make up. And so Dan and I are going to quiz him a little bit in a conversation at the International Festival of Arts and Ideas this afternoon at 5:30 on the Yale campus, right at the Yale Center for British Art. Hope you can join
Schiller
us.
does appear on the new Lil Yachty single, so it's not as far away as you think.
I'll make sure to ask him about that. I wanted to ask you quickly, Colin, about this lawsuit that Richard Blumenthal seems to be pretty key in. And this is a lawsuit about this obscure emoluments clause. It was obscure until fairly recently. And this has to do with whether or not Donald Trump has fully divested himself of all of his holdings while serving as president and also as the head of a big multinational business.
Right. Well, we know that he has not fully divested himself. I mean, his announcement about what he considered to be divestiture was such a far cry from anything that anybody would recognize. And people like Painter and Eisen, who were the ethics chiefs for Bush and Obama, have been very clear about that. They have their own suit about essentially the same thing. It's kind of an echo suit, but it has at least 200 members of Congress signing on to it. Blumenthal appears to be running point because he likes filing lawsuits. I don't know how far this actually will go. There may be a standing question. Although I think a good argument could be made that Congress, members of Congress do have standing to try to find out information about this. I think so just the nut question here appears to be, first of all, emoluments can only come from foreign governments, not foreign individuals. But if members of foreign governments are using Trump hotels and they're making a point of staying in Trump hotels, and he's not divested from these hotels, not in any remote sense is he divested from them. He's also not placed in a position where he can't find out who's staying in his hotels and how much extra money he's getting. So is that or some other kind of business relationship with foreign governments, is that an emoluments violation?
The answer, by the way, Colin, is so much extra money. You have no idea. So much extra money. Is this an overreach, Chris?
It may be legally. I mean, politically, I think it's a perfectly fair question. But my problem is the enormous conflict of interest potential that was residing here was known to the country when we had the election. Now we can keep clamoring about it, but my view of Trump is that I really don't need to know anything more about him. I mean, this is a catastrophe in policy, competence, character. I'd rather that Blumenthal spent his time asking why we're still in Afghanistan and Iraq. It might have a little more impact than this constant clamor about, that Trump is bad in a million ways, which I think we already know.
Well, maybe he could just walk down the hall and ask the aforementioned John McCain a question about that or two. But Aaliyah, a quick thought on this?
Yeah, so I think there's something to that, which is that we've seen in governments from around the world, particularly with candidates that we consider populist or populist-esque candidates, that the way that, really the way that you get in at them is exactly what you just mentioned, which was this idea of, discussing policy, right? Standing policy, as opposed to, well, here are these things that he's done that are bad. And I think one of the things to be concerned about is that, one, it's the Justice Department has come back and said that, no, this doesn't apply to him because he was a private citizen, and as president, he's a public citizen. So they're two different things. And I think what you're going to continue to see is a whole host of lawsuits that are being brought across the country by different states, by different groups. I think the vast majority of them will be tossed out. The ones that have standing are the ones that will probably be based on policy and not on politics.
So that's what Senator Richard Blumenthal is up to these days. Senator Chris Murphy spent some of his time this week stopping by our Where We Live studios with Lucy Nalpathanchel. There, amongst other things, he was responding to a heated exchange he had with the Education Secretary, Betsy DeVos, in a Senate hearing in which she referred to East Hartford High School as nothing more than adult daycare, a dangerous daycare. Here's Chris Murphy on Where We Live.
There are a lot of good private schools out there. There are a lot of great private charter schools in Connecticut and across the country. But that's not what Betsy DeVos historically supported. She has supported for-profit companies coming in and taking over these schools, for-profit companies that end up skimming, that end up driving up class sizes, that end up stripping services out of the schools in order to pay their CEOs millions of dollars, in order to pay their investors millions of dollars. And my question was, what are you going to do to make sure that your program just doesn't result in my taxpayer dollars going to enrich the CEOs and the investors of these for-profit companies? And as you heard, she would not answer that question.
So, Chris Powell, what Senator Murphy there is talking about is a plan that Betsy DeVos has had for quite some time. It's something she was supportive of in her private life. School voucher programs is the way that the Trump administration wants to reform education. She decided to get on East Hartford High, and that drew the ire of Chris Murphy. What are your thoughts, first of all, about the DeVos plan and how that plays into our backyard of East Hartford here?
Well, I suspect the real bone of contention here, John, is just whether the money is going to continue to flow from the government to the teachers' unions or it's going to go somewhere else. DeVos's little attack on East Hartford was pretty weak. She was, quoting a kid who graduated 17 years ago and had a bad experience, and she was using this as an argument to say that public education is failing everywhere, so we should cut the money to it. But I thought the response to it here in Connecticut was incredibly hypocritical. East Hartford and its school officials, its elected officials all got together, had a press conference and a rally to defend East Hartford and say how wonderful East Hartford schools were. But the problem was the school superintendent, the high school principal, and a high school teacher had just testified the previous year in the latest school financing lawsuit telling the court how lousy their school system was because it was overwhelmed by demographics, by the terrible demographics of East Hartford, the terrible poverty in town. And I think what East Hartford and its defenders were saying was that if being terrible gets East Hartford schools more money through the school financing lawsuit, then East Hartford schools will be terrible. But if being terrible gets East Hartford schools less money in the Trump budget, then they're not so bad after all.
Okay, a quick thought, Colin?
Actually, it's sort of hard to argue with Chris about this, although I'd like to it was a very immaculately stated point. And I think there's some truth to this. I think the fight is kind of fake. DeVos did something stupid based on almost nothing. We don't probably all agree about that. The question is, what debate should we be having? And I think the debate probably does start with, for reasons other than those cited by DeVos, some pretty major problems with urban and near-urban American school systems. And the question is, how are we going to address those problems? What's the right arsenal? It's not just going to be just one thing. It's not going to be just fuller funding of public education. There are going to be some private initiatives and some charters that are going to be in sort of spot cases effective. I don't think the charter movement has proven that it's overwhelmingly effective, and the critique offered and the private school movement, I think the critique offered by Murphy has some meat on its bones too. But so I don't know. I just don't feel like this is the right way to start this conversation.
Yeah. So I'll also jump in here and just make a mention that this is the second time that the Trump administration has talked about public education in the state of Connecticut. And the first time was in a briefing they put out a couple of months ago that mentioned that saw, I think, Hartford as a model for schools, particularly the magnet and the charter school programs, which, as everyone knows and everyone who's listening knows, that it's far more complicated than saying this should be a model for the rest of the country. And in fact, that there was a lot that went into that.
And model because there's a school choice program, because you have an option, a portfolio of different sorts of schools. Of course, that's mandated by a longstanding lawsuit in the state. But anyway.
Correct. And I think the lawsuit is key. I think that the continuing lawsuits about about education are also key. And then, as a parent who is very, very fortunate to have a child in a magnet school in Hartford, I will also say that choice doesn't necessarily mean that everyone has access. So I think we should consider that. So it's kind of interesting to see Hartford and East Hartford back in the news. But I think to Colin's point at the end, that this was not necessarily about. This is not a debate about is East Hartford East Hartford Public Schools amazing or what have you, but instead about what is going to be done with that money. What is the solution here? And the deep concern is that, okay, schools equal bad, therefore we privatize, therefore, right, and I think the concerns of Betsy DeVos's critics is, therefore, public schools get left behind again. And as we know, we've had huge kind of fights and arguments over that in the state of Connecticut. It's never as easy as to say, well, just the solution is, vouchers or charter schools.
Chris?
Well, I think the people who are drawing this as a fight between, billionaires running private school companies and, a wonderful idealistic public school system should consider whether we really have a public school system at all. Most of the money that is spent in the public schools is really not subject to democratic control at all. It's determined by Connecticut's collective bargaining and binding arbitration laws, which give enormous power to the unions, which are not public institutions. They're private institutions that are whose objective is to make sure that the union members do very well at the expense of the public. Secondly, if you think we have a public school system, I will invite you to go into any school administration office and ask to see the evaluation of your kids' teachers, because in Connecticut, alone among all public employees, the evaluations of teachers are exempted from the Freedom of Information Law at the insistence of the public school teacher unions. Now, I would argue that one of the big problems we have with public education in Connecticut, quite apart from the awful demographics in our cities and inner suburbs, which I think are controlling the situation. But the other problem is that, the public education is really not subject to ordinary democratic control.
I want to get a quick thought here from Mike in Torrington. Mike, go ahead.
Hi, this is Mike. So I don't understand. We're wasting so much time complaining about, these Betsy DeVos hearings, who's staying at Trump's hotel. Why don't we take all that time and energy into actually fixing things on our own? If everybody who's complaining about this actually did something and volunteered in East Hartford, we could fix these demographics ourselves. We could take care of everything ourselves instead of complaining what's happening in downtown Washington, in downtown Hartford. Let Washington do Washington. Let the people do their own thing and fix their own problems. Thank you.
Mike, thank you very much. So Mike wants us to fix our own problems. Thank you for the phone call. I'll tell you what, we're going to take a break. When we come back, we're going to talk about a controversy that Megyn Kelly has stirred up. Of course, she's the former Fox News host who's got a news show on NBC. Her first ever guest was Vladimir Putin. She's upping her game now, bringing on Alex Jones from InfoWars. We'll find out what some Sandy Hook parents think about that coming up next in the Wheelhouse. This is The Wheelhouse. We're talking about the week's news with Colin McEnroe, the host of The Colin McEnroe Show on WNPR. Leah Wright-Rigueur, who's an assistant professor of public policy at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government, and also Chris Powell, who's managing editor of the Journal Inquirer. As I was saying before the break, former Fox News host Megyn Kelly's got a brand new show on NBC. She's touched off a controversy, especially here in Connecticut, because she says she wants to shine a light on InfoWars host and conspiracy theorist / troll Alex Jones. I'm using the word troll in not in the sense that we use on the internet, Colin, because I actually believe he might be a troll. He, of course, amongst the many conspiracy theories that he's floated, is that the Sandy Hook shootings didn't happen. He's then backtracked on that, saying, well, they probably did happen. He was just playing devil's advocate with lunatic callers who were calling up his program. So what do you make of this? I mean, should Megyn Kelly be getting heat from not only the Hartford Courant on their editorial page, but also from Sandy Hook families for bringing on Alex Jones and trying to shine a light?
Yeah, I'm probably going to get in a little bit of trouble here. First of all, I'm not going to tell Sandy Hook families what they should or shouldn't do. Obviously, they have every right to their own sets of feelings about this, and I think their feelings are very legitimate. And I mean, Media Matters, by the way, has done a very good job of documenting everything that Alex Jones has ever said about Sandy Hook, and there really isn't a lot of room for him to backtrack in the way that he's trying to right now. He said what he said. He took the position that he took. He may find that a little less appetizing right now. And I think Alex Jones is a troll, and I've been following him for a really long time. And I think he's a disgusting human being. However, I actually do support Megyn Kelly's, not only her right, but I actually think there may be some value in this. I mean, the argument is that it's giving a platform to these unappetizing and completely fallacious views about certain things. But that platform already exists, and I do think Sunlight's a very good disinfectant in these situations. And I mean, there's a bitter and horrible irony here that has been explored by this man himself. But, Lenny Posner, who's one of the Sandy Hook parents, was an Alex Jones fan. He has actually said that he was probably listening to an Alex Jones podcast that morning. So it's not as though Alex Jones reaches only, 18 people sitting in trailers in some, obscure parts of America. Even in a beautiful, lovely place like Newtown, there are people who are listening to this stuff and believing some of his conspiracy theories. If Megyn Kelly can kind of punch a hole in him or expose him, I think that is her goal, to expose him for what she thinks he is. Let her try. I think that's a good thing.
Leah?
Yeah, this morning he tweeted out something again on Sandy Hook. And, it's, I think, particularly coming from this place, coming from this state, coming from, the atrocity that happened here, it is really, really hard. And to see how the parents continue to be harassed to this day, to this moment, by kind of trollers, but also kind of really hateful people, including one woman, I believe, who was just recently convicted for this kind of thing. It's really hard to see how exposure, right, will make this thing better, unless Megyn Kelly really intends to press him. Now, from what she's done so far, and in terms of her journalism, I haven't really seen that side of Megyn Kelly. Her interview with Putin, I thought, was very soft. She didn't really push him on too many things. I think, we've seen her push a little bit on Donald Trump. And I'm really, really struggling. And I see, Colin, I see your point, but I'm really struggling to see that. Now, with that said, she does have the right? This is her show. This is her agenda, what have you. She does have the right to bring him on her show. But advertisers also have the right to pull from the show, which they are doing.
Which has been happening.
Right. And viewers have the right to turn the TV off, which has also been happening. Her ratings are dropping dramatically. So, I mean, the expectation is, yes, free speech, all of that good stuff. But one, he doesn't deserve a platform. He's not entitled to a platform. And she's not entitled, right, to give him one.
Chris Powell?
Well, he already has a platform. I don't know if it's necessary to interview him. We haven't seen the interview. Maybe she, has put critical questions to him that will show whether he's a good or bad guy. But I think there's a policy question here that I'd like to raise, because I'm not terribly happy of the political involvement of the Sandy Hook families, because they took our right to know here in Connecticut away. After the shooting, a few months after the shooting, they persuaded the governor and legislature and the hysteria and grief of the moment to pass an exemption to the state's Freedom of Information Act, so that government photos of homicide victims are no longer presumed to be public records. Alex Jones and his ilk are pushing this hoax business, in part because there are no public pictures from the police investigation of the massacre at the elementary school. Now, I'm not sure that the people who believe Alex Jones would believe pictures, but we do know that pictures of the Holocaust and the Armenian genocide and other things like that have been helpful in setting hoaxers back on their heels. Well, unfortunately, in Connecticut, we have a law that says police photos of homicide victims are not publicly disclosable. And the irony is that law was passed in part, made general, and didn't just apply to the Newtown shooting, but was made general for all homicide victims at the insistence of black and Hispanic legislators who saw a lot of black and Hispanic people being killed in the city. So they wanted photos of those victims ruled outside the public sphere as well. And now those same legislators are complaining that there's no police video, no police photos of the shooting of the kid in Bridgeport, the 15-year-old kid in Bridgeport, who was shot last month. Well, wait a minute. Doesn't this say that there is a public interest in getting photos of homicide victims so we can question the government story?
First of all, I attended those hearings in a state of outrage. I agree with Chris overall, Chris's sentiment overall about. I think the question I would have there is, can you really lay this at the feet of the Sandy Hook families? I saw an awful lot of politicians who were very comfortable with this idea, who maybe had Sandy Hook as a little more fuel in their tank, and a lot of those politicians Eric Coleman was every bit as appalling to me as Len Fasano. It seemed like both parties were very excited about this whole idea. I don't know that you can blame the Sandy Hook families. First of all, people in that position are going to get involved. And there's no better example than Dr. Pettit. Dr. Pettit has been through a terrible tragedy, but he got involved in the death penalty debate. We know as a matter of record, he changed 2 votes one year. Andy Maynard and Edith Prague said because of Dr. Pettit, they couldn't vote to abolish the death penalty. Dr. Pettit is now in the legislature. So obviously, people who go through stuff like this, they're going to be radicalized, they're going to be politicized. You can't blame them for that. What else do they have to do? They want to do something. I agree,
well,
Chris.
They could pick the right public policy, not the wrong public policy.
Right, but they're in a state of incredible grief. You know what could happen is the legislators could pick the right public policy. Eric Coleman and Len Fasano could pick the right public policy. That's not the job of the Sandy Hook families. That's the job of the people who get elected to pick good public policies.
Yeah, and just a quick last thought on this, Lee. I think we all agree more information about terrible things is better than less information about terrible things, because hopefully then we'll find out more about how to avoid them. I think a big question right now is something you raised before is how much do we want to put up on a platform a guy, Alex Jones, who already has, as Chris said, his own platform. He already has the ear of the President of the United States, as we quite well know. Is there something damaging that comes out of him getting a chance to talk through and explain away his conspiracy theories to a wider public?
Right, or soften him, right? So make him come across as somebody who is, understandable, who is relatable, who is, I'm not this gravelly voiced guy who shouts on the radio. I'm misunderstood, and I'm just trying to, work in the interest of transparency. So really kind of softening the blow or cushioning the blow. But with that said, I'm going to contradict myself a little bit, because I think this is a really difficult question, which is that what do we do? How do we do, or what do we do with something like InfoWars, which is in Alex Jones, which has gone from the fringes of the internet, even with its large following, to now being quoted in presidential briefings, in press reports or press releases that are put out, and to getting press credentials to the White House, right? So now, when our president says, I respect Alex Jones, I go on his shows, and quotes him or cites him as evidence, that's deeply troubling in a way that we have to address. I'm not quite sure what the proper way is to address that, but it is something that needs to be addressed.
We just have a couple minutes left, and boy, there's so much that we didn't get a chance to talk about. I quickly want to ask Chris Powell about the news that came out of the end of the legislative session, that we might get a little closer, at least, to the state voting on a transportation lockbox, this thing that the governor has been waiting for some long time, to get money into a special transportation fund and have it not be spent by the legislature on other stuff, actually use it to build up our roads and bridges.
Well, in the first place, it's not really a lockbox, because the money would not be locked up until it was actually deposited in the fund, and the legislature could divert it before it got into the fund. It could also redefine transportation expenses. The amendment is really as phony as the spending cap amendment that was passed the year after the state income tax, which required enabling legislation that was never passed, so spending was never capped. But the governor has said that, he won't go along with tolls, and some legislators have said they won't go along with tolls unless there is a lockbox. So effectively, this referendum we'll have on the constitutional amendment next year, John, is a referendum on tolls. If you vote for the lockbox, you're actually going to get tolls.
You're voting on the tolls that will go into the lockbox. Colin, I want to ask you about that, but I should ask you about something else we saw in the news this week. Amazon says they're going to locate 1,800 jobs at a site that's been unused for years and years. Republican Len Fasano says this is a really good thing for the state of Connecticut. Once again, this is another one of those deals through the First Five program that Governor Malloy has, giving some money to a company to bring jobs in. Is this, with just a minute left, is this deal different than some of the other ones we've talked about in the past?
Well, the money isn't as big, right? I mean, the incentives don't seem to be quite as huge to me.
$25 million as opposed to, say, $115 million or whatever it was for the world's largest hedge fund.
But the jobs aren't as good. I don't know. I actually don't have a really good answer to that. It's not the way that I think we should do economic development. I think we should create environments where people want to come and locate their companies here because of what's available, as opposed to bribing people to either come or stay.
Colin McEnroe hosts the Colin McEnroe Show on WNPR, creating an environment for conversation this afternoon. Thank you, Colin.
Thank you.
Thanks also to Leah Wright-Rigueur from Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. Thank you, Leah.
Always a pleasure.
And thanks to Chris Powell, managing editor of the Journal-Inquirer. Thank you, Chris.
Thank you, John.
Thanks to Katie Tolarski and Kyone Wolf for producing today's show. I'm John Dankosky. Thanks for joining us.